My parents kicked me out before my SAT so my sister's friends could stay over and told me to live on the streets. Hey, everyone. So, I'm 17, and for what feels like forever, I've been preparing for the SAT. But my family? Yeah, they're the absolute worst. Out of nowhere, they decided to kick me out of the house and ship me off to my aunt's place in the suburbs. Why? Because my sister's getting married in 2 weeks, and she invited her friends to stay at our house. Now, I don't get why she couldn't have just booked them a hotel like all the other guests. Sure, it would have cost her money, but come on, it's her wedding. If there's ever a time to not be cheap, it's now. Plus, our parents are already covering so many of the expenses, so it wouldn't have been a big deal for them to handle that too. But nope, instead of making a reasonable choice, they decided the best solution was to kick me out of my own room. And the worst part? They didn't even give me a heads up. They waited until the night before her friends were supposed to fly in to drop this bomb on me, telling me I had exactly 24 hours to clear out. I tried to argue, suggesting that her friends could crash in the living room or the guest room. After all, there were nearly 7 of them, and that seemed way more logical. But my parents shut me down immediately, saying it would be impolite to make guests stay in the living room while I got a whole bedroom to myself. They even had the nerve to lecture me about hospitality, as if I was the one making all these ridiculous decisions. What really got me, though, was that my sister, Elise, and her fiancé, Garrett, have their own apartment. So I threw out another idea: maybe some of her friends could stay with them. But, of course, my parents shot that down too, saying that Elise and Garrett didn't want the added stress of hosting guests before their wedding. I mean, seriously? So it's too stressful for them, but it's totally fine to uproot me right before one of the most important exams of my life? I tried everything to convince them to let me stay, but it was useless. Apparently, Elise had already promised her friends that they could stay at our house, and since my parents agreed to it, I was just expected to fall in line. But I wasn't about to give up that easily. I made it very clear that I had no intention of going to my aunt's place, especially not right before the SAT. She's, let's just say a unique character. She doesn't believe in the internet, which means no Wi-Fi, and I couldn't afford to burn through my data while studying. I explained all of this to my parents, but they brushed it off like it didn't matter. Just take your books with you, they said, as if that would somehow make up for losing access to all my online study materials. And then there was the issue of distance. My aunt's place is way out in the suburbs, miles away from my SAT testing center. The commute would be a nightmare, and I couldn't risk being late. I even offered to stay in the living room myself to make things easier, but my parents wouldn't hear it. They said it would be unseemly and that I had no choice, I had to leave. End of discussion. At that point, I lost my patience and told them straight up that I wasn't going anywhere. That's when things got ugly. They threatened that if I didn't leave voluntarily, they'd throw all my stuff out on the street. And knowing them, they weren't bluffing. I didn't have much of a choice, so after a couple of hours of arguing, I finally gave in and started packing. My parents acted like I'd just made some noble sacrifice, telling me they were proud that I was doing something good for the family. But then they hit me with another curveball. They told me I needed to call my aunt myself to ask if she was okay with me staying there. That's when it really sank in. They hadn't even bothered to check with her first. They just assumed I'd handle it. That was the final straw. I snapped, yelling at them about how ridiculous this whole situation was. But instead of listening, they doubled down, saying it wasn't their responsibility to take care of me anymore because I was almost an adult and needed to start looking out for myself. Almost an adult? I was 17. Even if I had already turned 18, they were still my parents. That didn't suddenly stop being their job. I was furious, so I did the only thing I could. I stopped packing and told them flat out that I wasn't leaving. That's when they really lost it. They started yelling, saying I had no right to refuse because they had already given their word to Elise. Apparently, since they had promised her friends a place to stay, I had to be the one to sacrifice my space. I tried to explain, again, that my SAT was more important than making sure Elise's friends got free lodging, but they didn't care. Elise always came first. Even though I knew it was probably pointless, I figured I'd try calling her directly. Maybe, just maybe, she'd talk to our parents and convince them to let me stay. We've never been close, and honestly, I don't like her much. She doesn't like me either, but I thought that, for once, she might actually have my back. I was dead wrong. When I explained the situation and asked her to talk to our parents, she told me to put her on speaker. Then, in the coldest tone imaginable, she made it crystal clear, she had already promised her friends they could stay at our house, and she wasn't about to break that promise. She didn't care about my SAT or anything else, I just needed to get out. And if I had nowhere to go? That was my problem. If I ended up on the street, so be it. And the worst part? My parents didn't say a word. They just stood there, silently agreeing with her. That's when it hit me, I wasn't really part of this family. Not in any way that mattered. To be honest, I don't even think my family considers me part of them anymore. That realization was the final straw. Without another word, I grabbed my bags and headed to a friend's house. Obviously, it wasn't an ideal situation. I hated feeling like a burden on someone else's family. But they've been incredibly kind to me, assuring me I could stay as long as I needed. They understood I was going through a tough time, and I can't even begin to explain how much that meant. It's been 4 days since I left home, and yesterday, I finally took the SAT. Thankfully, it went pretty well, despite everything that had been weighing on me these past few days. But once the test was over and I got back, I finally let myself think about everything that had happened. Until then, I had been running on autopilot, pushing my emotions aside so I could stay focused on my studies. But now that the SAT was behind me, all the feelings I had been suppressing came rushing in, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It was just so unfair. There was absolutely no real reason why I had to leave my own home. Even if I didn't stay in my room, I could have just slept in the living room. But for some reason, they were determined to push me out. It was humiliating. And the more I thought about it, the more upset I became. That's when I decided to reach out to Garrett, Elisa's fiancé. I didn't do it with the intention of ruining anything for her. I just felt like he deserved to know the kind of person he was about to marry, along with the kind of family he was marrying into. I had no idea that this one message would set off a chain reaction. There's only a week left until the wedding, and this morning, I found out from my parents that everything is falling apart. Apparently, Garrett has called off the wedding. My parents are furious, and they know it's because of me. They're among the few people who actually understand the real reason behind his decision. Turns out, after I messaged Garrett last night, he confronted Elise and demanded to know what was going on. And instead of making up some excuse, she actually admitted the truth. She had pressured our parents to kick me out of the house so her friends could have a place to stay. Just like any reasonable person, Garrett was horrified. He couldn't believe they had thrown me out at such a crucial time in my life, especially with the SAT just days away. He pointed out the same solutions I had suggested. Why couldn't I have just stayed in the living room? Why couldn't some of her friends stay at their apartment? Or better yet, why couldn't they have just booked a hotel like normal guests? But Elise kept making up excuses, one after another, until finally, she told him the real reason. She admitted that she just didn't want me in the house. Not because of space, not because of logistics, just because she found me annoying. She didn't want to have to see me around when she came over to visit her friends. That was it. That was the whole reason I was kicked out and put through all this stress right before my SATs. And the worst part? My parents were completely on board with it. When she told Garrett all of this, they got into a huge fight. He called her selfish and heartless, saying he couldn't believe she would do something like that to her own brother. He told her she needed to apologize to me and find a way to make it up to me. But Elise refused. She straight up said she didn't like me and didn't think I deserved an apology. That only made things worse. Eventually, Garrett had enough. He told her he couldn't be with someone like that and called off the wedding. After their fight, he left and didn't even bother reaching out to her. At first, Elise didn't take it seriously. She figured he'd cool off and come back. But when he didn't return the next morning, she started freaking out. That's when my parents called me, demanding that I fix this. They told me that since I was the one responsible for this whole mess, I needed to talk to Garrett and convince him to change his mind. But what exactly did they expect me to say? I had only told him the truth. What was I supposed to do now? Call him up and lie? Pretend I had made everything up? Yeah, not happening. I told my parents that even if I could fix this, I wouldn't. Because, in my opinion, Garrett made the right decision. And it wasn't my job to fix my sister's relationship. If she wanted to save it, she should be the one doing something about it. Besides, this is the same sister who told me to go live on the streets when I asked for help. Why should I step in and help her now? My family has always treated me terribly, but I never really had anywhere else to go. I'm not particularly close to anyone else, and my grandparents live out of state. Plus, I've always been the kind of person who struggles to ask for help. Even showing up at my friend's place and asking to stay with them was incredibly difficult for me. And up until now, I've never really opened up to anyone about just how badly my parents and sister have treated me. Now that I had finally found the courage to speak up, there was no way I was going to backtrack and try to mend things between Garrett and Elise. I made it clear to my parents I wasn't just refusing to talk to Garrett to fix things, but I was also planning to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person Elise was and just how awful they had been to me. They deserved to face the consequences. I told them straight up that I was going to post about the whole situation on social media. I wanted the world to know the real reason why the wedding had been called off. And that's when their attitude did a complete 180. Suddenly, they weren't yelling at me anymore, they were begging. Because as of now, Elise and Garrett hadn't made any formal announcements, and if I got ahead of it and exposed the truth, Elise would no doubt turn on them for letting me find out in the first place. My parents were desperate to keep things quiet, promising me anything I wanted as long as I didn't post about it. Honestly, I found it pathetic. The only reason they cared now was because they didn't want to upset Elise. Not because they regretted how they treated me, not because they realized they had been unfair, just because they didn't want to be blamed for the fallout. But as much as I wanted to expose them, I wasn't sure if posting about it online was the right move. What if I did it before Elise or Garrett said anything? Would it just drag me even further into this mess? Update 1. In the end, I decided not to make a post. After reading through some comments and thinking it over, I realized that I didn't want to get even more tangled up in this drama. If I spoke out online, I'd just be opening the door for more chaos, and I was already exhausted from dealing with all of this. Instead, I made a different decision. I blocked my parents and Elise. I don't want anything to do with them anymore. However, I did decide to reach out to my paternal grandparents. Even though we don't see each other often, I've always felt closer to them than to anyone else in my family. And now that I had finally chosen to start talking about what I'd been through, I figured they were the right people to start with. So, for the first time, I told them everything. Not just about what had happened recently, but about all the past incidents that made it clear I was never really a priority to my family. Elise's hatred for me wasn't new, she's always been this way. The only difference this time was that things escalated to a more extreme level. I also already knew that my parents preferred her over me. She was the golden child, the perfect daughter. But I never imagined they would take their favoritism so far as to kick me out of my own home just to accommodate her friends. Looking back, I realize I've always been treated badly, but I never felt comfortable enough to talk about it. I didn't think I was close enough to anyone to bring it up, and honestly, I've never been the type to ask for help. I just kept it all to myself. But after seeing Garrett's reaction, after watching someone who isn't even related to me recognize how wrong this was and immediately cut ties, I realized I needed to start speaking up. If Garrett, a total outsider, could see how toxic my family was and walk away, then surely my grandparents and others who actually cared about me would do the same. So, I finally opened up to them. And they reacted exactly the way I had hoped they would. Since they live out of state, I had to talk to them over the phone. But after I told them everything, my grandfather immediately said they were flying in by the end of the week. He didn't go into detail about their plans, but he made it clear they weren't going to stand by and let this continue. My grandmother was especially heartbroken. She kept apologizing to me, saying she felt like she had failed as a mother because if her son, my father, had been raised right, he never would have treated his own child this way. That actually settled something that had been in the back of my mind for years. I had always wondered if I was even their biological child. The way they treated me, like I was disposable, made me feel like I had to be adopted or something, like maybe that was why they found it so easy to push me aside. But now I knew the truth. I was their biological daughter. There was no logical reason for why they treated me this way, other than the fact that they simply didn't care. As for Elise, I never wasted much energy trying to figure out why she hated me. I always just assumed she was an insecure brat who couldn't stand the thought of someone else, especially her younger sister, getting any attention. She always needed to be the center of everything, and if that meant making me feel small and insignificant, then so be it. And, of course, my parents always enabled her. I have no doubt that she's furious right now. In her mind, Garrett leaving her is my fault. If I had never told him what happened, they'd still be getting married this week. But the reality is, she's the one who pushed things to this point. And no matter how much she blames me, it doesn't change the fact that her actions are what ruined everything. From what I can tell, she hasn't made any official statement about the wedding yet, and neither has Garrett. I've blocked her, but I haven't blocked him. In fact, I still follow him on social media. Since I still follow Garrett on social media, I'll know if he decides to post anything about the situation. But honestly, that's not my concern right now. My main focus is waiting for my grandparents to arrive, and once they do, I'll finally be able to get out of my friend's hair. She and her parents have been incredibly kind to me, and I can tell she was a little disappointed when I told her I'd be leaving by the end of the week. But we'll still see each other at school, so it's not like we're saying goodbye forever. She understands that this has to happen eventually, and so do I. Still, I'll miss her. I'll miss her parents too. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly wanted somewhere, which is both heartwarming and bittersweet. Update 2. My grandparents finally made it here. They had to wait until the end of the week because they had some work to wrap up before they could leave, especially since they weren't sure how long they'd need to stay. A lot has happened in the past few days. It's been 4 days since my last update, and just yesterday, Elise and Garrett put out a statement on social media saying they've decided to postpone their wedding indefinitely. The post had both their names at the bottom, so I'm guessing they finally talked things through and came to that decision together. I was actually surprised they used the word postpone instead of cancel because, from what I last heard, Garrett was completely done. But I guess it makes sense. Garrett and Elise have been together since middle school, and they've had an on and off relationship for years. Lately, they had managed to stay together, aside from a few rough patches. Maybe this is just another one of those times where they plan to work things out. Honestly, good for them. Garrett never responded to the message I sent him about everything that happened. I only found out through my parents that he confronted Elise and told her he was calling off the wedding. But from what little I know of him, he seems like a decent guy. If Elise can convince him to stay, then good for her. I just hope he knows what he's signing up for. Anyway, my grandparents arrived last night, and the first thing they did was go straight to my friend's house to personally thank her and her parents for taking me in and taking such good care of me. I was overjoyed to see them, but what made me even happier was knowing that now that they were here, they planned to bring my other grandparents into the conversation as well. I wasn't sure how that would go since I've never been particularly close to my maternal grandparents, but after thinking it over, I decided it was worth a shot. So, last night, we called them and told them everything about my family, about Elise, about the way I've been treated my entire life. After my grandparents finished thanking my friend's family, I was already packed, so I left with them and moved into the hotel they're staying at. I even got my own room, which was pretty cool. Later that night, we called my other grandparents and told them everything, and their reaction was exactly what I expected. They were furious. Unfortunately, they can't fly out to see me right now because my grandmother is very sick. She can barely move, so traveling isn't an option for her, which I completely understand. But even though they can't be here physically, we still had a long discussion over the phone, and as a family, we made a decision. I'm not going back home. Ever since I left and blocked my parents, they haven't made a single attempt to reach out to me or check in on how I'm doing. The only time they contacted me was when they were furious about the mess I supposedly caused by telling Garrett the truth. Other than that, silence. That made things crystal clear. I was never really one of them. Now that my grandparents see how things truly are, they believe the best course of action is for me to stay here with my friend until I graduate high school if her family is willing to have me. Then, once I finish school, I can move in with my paternal grandparents until I start college. I thought it was a great plan. So this morning, my grandparents and I sat down with my friend's parents and talked it over. They were more than happy to take me back in until I finished school, and my grandparents insisted on covering all my expenses as a way to thank them for everything they had already done. But my friend's parents? They wouldn't even accept the money. They said they were well off enough and didn't need any compensation for helping me. My grandparents kept insisting, though, and eventually, they managed to find some way to contribute. I can't even put into words how grateful I am. I get to live with my best friend, which is something we used to joke about all the time. Every time I complained about my parents, she would always tell me that her family would be happy to take me in if I ever needed it. And now, I know she wasn't just saying that to be nice, she truly meant it. And honestly, I think that's rare. Not many people are lucky enough to have friends like that. At this point, my best friend feels more like my real sister than Elise ever did. Honestly, she's definitely the better sister between the two, that's for sure. I'm beyond grateful that my grandparents stepped in and made all these arrangements for me. They're even handling the legal side of things, and as I type this, they're in the process of contacting my parents to finalize everything. I'll keep you all updated on how that goes. Update 3. Hey, everyone. A couple of weeks have passed since my last update, and things have completely turned around for the better. For starters, I'm now officially living with my best friend and have absolutely no contact with my parents. After my grandparents confronted them, my parents decided to sign away their parental rights over me. Just like that. They didn't even fight it. My grandparents now have full custody, and once I finish high school, I'll be moving in with them permanently. The best part? None of my grandparents want anything to do with my parents anymore either. They've completely cut ties, and honestly, that feels like justice. My parents are finally facing consequences for how they've treated me all these years. Another huge relief, I don't have to worry about college anymore. Before, I thought I'd either have to take out student loans or work my way through school just to afford tuition. But my grandparents reassured me that they're covering everything, so I can focus entirely on my education without financial stress. I tried to feel bad about how easily my parents gave up their rights to me. I really did. But all I felt was relief. No sadness, no regret, just a deep sense of freedom. I don't have to deal with them ever again, and I can't find a single reason to be upset about that. From what my grandparents told me, the rest of the family now knows what happened. They're aware of how my parents treated me and how they just signed me away like I was nothing. And at least for now, it seems like a lot of our relatives are distancing themselves from them. On top of that, several people have reached out to check in on me. They haven't brought up the situation directly, but I know that's why they suddenly decided to message me, and I genuinely appreciate it. Oh, and here's another update: Elise and Garrett are officially over. They called off the wedding for good. Turns out, it wasn't just what I told Garrett that made him walk away. Apparently, Elise had been getting more and more controlling ever since they got engaged, and Garrett was already struggling to deal with her behavior. They had been fighting constantly, and me exposing what happened was just the final straw. That said, I'm not taking their breakup too seriously. They've had plenty of dramatic splits in the past, and if they really want to, I wouldn't be surprised if they got back together at some point. But honestly, that's none of my business anymore. All I care about is that I finally get to live life the way I want. I don't have to see my parents, I don't have to deal with Elise, and I don't have to walk on eggshells in my own home. My best friend and her parents have been incredible, and for the first time in a long time, I'm genuinely happy. Even my other friends have noticed how much I've changed. They told me I always seemed stressed and anxious before, but now? Now, I'm a lot more relaxed, more carefree. And they're right, I feel lighter, freer, like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying has finally been lifted. And honestly, I couldn't be happier.